Okay, well, hello, everybody. Again, thank you so much for logging on to this call tonight. We have a very exciting presentation by Lily that is here with us tonight. She's going to be talking about the barriers and experiences with LGBTQIA plus foster youth. She is currently an advocate with CASA. Some of you may recognize her, some of you may have talked to her before because she is also our intern. So we're very excited and just happy to have her here with us tonight talking with us. I'm going to hand it over to Lily to introduce herself a little bit more, and then she will get into her presentation.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you everyone for hopping on. My name is Lily. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a senior at Clark University in Worcester, but I'm originally from Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm studying sociology and women's and gender studies, and I have been with CASA for about a year and a half now, which is very strange to think about. It's been a long time, but I'm recently an advocate. So that's been amazing and a great addition to my life. So this last spring, I did research on the barriers and experience of LGBTQIA plus foster youth. So we'll be talking a lot about intersectionality and the experiences that these youth who are not exposed for all the barriers that they experience. So I'm going to quickly turn my camera off and get my screen shared, and then we'll get started.
Lily, how do you prefer questions coming in? Would you like to just set time aside at the end, or do you want people to just ask as they come to their minds?
Maybe at like 40 or 40, no, this is not an hour. So maybe at like 6:10, 6:15, we could do questions.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
It says loading.
Yeah, you're right. That is how it's looking on my end as well.
That is very strange. Let me try this again.
There we go.
Okay, amazing. So welcome. Well, this is our little table of contents. So we're going to talk a lot about the terminology that's important to use when we're talking about LGBTQIA plus foster youth, and the queer community. We're then going to talk about general foster care research and how different accentuating circumstances can impact foster care and foster youth. And talk about intersectionality, which is a big term that is very common in everyday life. Then we're going to talk about the impact on foster care youth and when they are ascribing to the queer community, as well as resources in Worcester. And then we're going to conclude with how we can help as advocates. So this big word, you've probably heard it a lot. It's taken many forms. At one point, it was just LGB, and that was it. No T, no Q, nothing more. And that was way back in the day when transgender individuals were not considered at all as individuals. So the fact that this term has, grown to encapsulate so many more individuals is really amazing. So this term in whole stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer and/or questioning, and asexual, and I'll be breaking down most of those as well. So queer is an umbrella term. You might hear me throughout the presentation using it to describe LGBTQIA plus individuals, and it can be interpreted by everyone differently. Some people use it very generically, just to say that someone is part of that community, but also individuals who don't necessarily have a term to define themselves at the moment or ever may use this term to describe themselves as their identity. And then another term that often gets mixed up or kind of lost in translation is the term of non-binary or genderqueer. This also can be an umbrella term, but it's an individual who does not ascribe to being a male or a female. This does not mean it's a third gender, which is a misconception, very common misconception. Because it's a umbrella term, it's truly just, it is an umbrella term. It's whatever the individual who identifies as non-binary wants it to be for themselves. So, you know, you have to think of it more fluidly as gender being on a line of, you might be on one end, you might be on another end, or you might be on a y-axis or on a z-axis, and somewhere off wherever you identify for yourself, whether it be more with masculinity or femininity, as opposed to ascribing to being a male or a female, a boy or a girl. And then asexual, it's recent that this was put on, the larger LGBTQIA plus term. So it's great that, this concept is being recognized in greater society. And this is just someone who maybe doesn't involve with or relates to sex and doesn't necessarily identify with sexuality whatsoever. So not having sexual feelings towards others. And this quote kind of put it in context for me too. In general, an asexual person does not feel or otherwise experience any sexual attraction. So it's an inborn absence of sexual desire. And this presentation has a lot of fancy terms in it, a lot of terms that right now maybe are not the most familiar to you, and that's okay. The conversation is in one sense trying to get individuals and advocates more equipped with the vocabulary that they need to be advocates and to be accepting of the youth they interact with, and also on the other hand to make this research much more widely known. So whatever you get out of it, you get out of it, and that's great. And maybe after, if you're like, I don't really get it, you go and do some of the research on your own. A lot of this stuff is it can be found in your online Google searches and everything. But hopefully just a lot of this will put into perspective some of the areas that maybe you're not equipped with knowledge in. So understanding the reality of each individual's experience. While many LGBTQ youth come into contact with the child welfare system for the same reasons as straight youth, LGBTQIA plus youth are much more likely than straight youth to receive services for reasons such as running away, parental refusal to provide care, trauma and parental conflict. Queer youth and youth of color are generally overrepresented in DCF custody. Hopefully this kind of starts to get the gears kind of cranking in your head to understand why we need to put so much emphasis on this issue, because there is that lack of attention to youth who don't ascribe to being straight, and maybe don't ascribe to the gender binary or to what society defines as stereotypical and as normal. So the intersectionality of the experiences of homophobia and transphobia, racism and abuse and neglect should generate the most heightened level of care and concern for young people. That starts with the collection of data telling us who and where they are. Instead, their data is hard to find and generally non-existent. So a few things I want to touch on there. One is the definition of intersectionality. Intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. She is a Black female lawyer who found that there wasn't a proper way to define the experiences of Black women. Often in law, you talk about this person experienced or was a victim of racism, and this person was a victim of sexism, but there wasn't a way to describe the experiences of Black women and how they experienced racism and sexism as a combined experience. So now what we're going to do is take that idea of intersectionality, which does not necessarily have to be about race and gender, but it can be about different ways that you interact with society. It can be about your sexuality, it can be about your gender expression, and it can be about your class status, religion, anything. So We're going to talk about how your sexuality, your race, and your home life and stability may intersect to create an intersecting identity of a queer foster youth. I also want to touch on the idea that this data is very hard to find. I can confirm it is very hard to find. There is not a lot of it at all. And a lot of the articles that I touch on or the research that I touch on is exactly what's out there. Like everything in this presentation is what there is, which is really, frustrating. So, if you hear anything, please send it my way, but also just, understand that everything you're hearing, all the hard facts, all the really, really large numbers, indicating that queer foster youth, suffer and struggle. There is so little research done to find them resources and support, which is why I'm very grateful you all are here to, hear about everything that we need to do to, as advocates, to make their lives, just a little bit easier, a little less stressful. So foster youth and queer foster youth experience heightened levels of stigma, heightened levels of aggression and violence, suffer from poor mental health. Their stressors are accentuated by their intersected identity. And one other thing that I really like for context is the first anti-hate law within foster care was made 21 years ago. Or the first anti-hate law regarding queer individuals was 21 years ago, which is not a long time ago. I was born 21 years ago. So if you're looking at me and you're like, wow, she's young, I wasn't born that long ago. So there you go. There's not a lot of urgency to meet the needs of underrepresented individuals. So we'll talk about gender disparities. I don't want to make it come across that boys are not impacted and that girls are the only individuals impacted. Foster youth all around are negatively impacted by the foster care system. That is just how it is. There are about 40% girls, 52% boys in foster care. That's the breakdown. And as far as girls and boys experience the foster care system, girls are more likely to experience sexual abuse and other forms of mistreatment at higher rates. Sorry, my roommates might be making noise. And then girls also experience higher rates of victimization, which you may have heard, women experiencing victimization for doing things that are out of the ordinary, doing things that don't confine to society's terms. That is only heightened when those women or those girls, those individuals are in foster care and out of home custody. For men, their research shows that there's high rates of substance abuse long-term and high rates of mental health disorders long-term when those boys are in foster care. PTSD is another really important concept and diagnosis to understand. There's a lot of research that proves that PTSD affects foster youth long-term down the road, regardless of how long their stay was in foster care. And it, intersects with your gender. So, having PTSD is an identity marker, and being a female is an identity marker, and being female increases the risk of an immediate diagnosis of PTSD. Prior to placement, girls were more likely to be victims of sexual and or emotional abuse. So that's just another example of the impact of being a woman in foster care, a girl in foster care, and a girl in an unstable home. I also want to talk about kinship care. Kinship care is the understanding that a youth is staying with maybe a grandma or an aunt or an uncle. So they're still in, somewhat direct family, somewhat immediate family, but it's not with the original parent or guardian. A lot of the time in foster care, and when you're working as an advocate, you're working on these cases, the initial goal is the child being reunited with the parent, being reunited with the family. A lot of the time that is not necessarily possible, and therefore the next best, scenario is to be placed with someone who's in the family, someone that the child is maybe familiar with, someone who has access to a lot of the records and a lot of the family information that that kid may need down the line. There are disadvantages though, and that's what the research shows, and that definitely comes into play when you're understanding the barriers of queer foster youth. Families who are accustomed to disadvantage, discrimination, and traumatic experiences may lack the capacity for the amount and type of nurturance and empathy youth in foster care need. And this kind of extends to the idea that a lot of the time, social ideas and social norms are going to be similar within your family. So if a child is in a homophobic Christian family and that child decides, I don't, ascribe to Christianity, and also, I'm not straight, I'm queer. If that child is then placed with the grandmother, that same mentality, that same social idea is going to be continued, and therefore continue that level of mistreatment and that level of blame and neglect. This other quote is important to understand. Untreated PTSD and other emotional disturbances related to trauma maybe create patterns of unresponsiveness that are transmitted through poor attachment relationships in families. So with that level of neglect, us as advocates may be thinking, oh, this is a better position for our youth, keeping them within, somewhat immediate family, but at the end, there may be a lack of attention paid to how the child is really doing, because we think they're staying within the family, they're staying within individuals that they're familiar with, but there may, on the flip side, be untreated mental health issues because we're paying less attention to how that child is acclimating to this new environment. So we all lived through the COVID-19 pandemic. It's still going on, which is really great. I was reminded of that today when my roommate tested positive for COVID. So that's unfortunate, of course, more for her than for me. But it's just a reminder that it has not gone away. So yeah, and I think the COVID-19 pandemic is another way for us to analyze the different ways big societal concepts impact our foster youth. So we've talked about gender, we've talked about mental health and PTSD, we've talked about, where we're relocating our youth to. Now we're going to talk about geological disruption. So, COVID-19 pandemic it was a humanitarian emergency. There was geological disruption. It was a serious disease outbreak. So, jobs were lost. There was huge amounts of disruption to where individuals can afford to live, where individuals are safe to live. And there was a huge impact on our health industry and how individuals can receive adequate health in the event that they do get sick, or they, break their leg and then have to go to the hospital and then end up getting sick. So it was a direct impact on the individual. It was a direct impact on communities and at a societal level. And what we know from the research is that LGBTQIA+, women, and single parents were 3 large groups that were significantly impacted at a higher rate than non-LGBTQIA+ individuals, by individuals who identify as men, and by individuals who maybe were in a more stable relationship, stable family, stable home. So there was housing and food insecurity, employment, and financial instability. When we think of foster youth, those are 3 huge things that youth often lack. They often lack housing and food security. They often lack the ability to make money for themselves, make money within whatever placement they're in. And they often don't have a very stable financial background. So I can tell you in, one of my cases, one of my youth wants to work for herself, wants to provide for herself, but because she's, in fear that she won't be able to provide for herself down the line, but she's not old enough to do that yet. But these are the things that foster youth are already concerned about because they've already had to be concerned about it for themselves from such a young age. Youth who aged out of care, cisgender females, non-straight youth, and non-white youth were significantly more likely than demographic counterparts to experience pandemic-related adversities. And that just kind of encapsulates everything we're talking about. Throughout our conversation, I have and will continue to touch on intersectionality. It's easy perhaps to analyze and understand this amidst a pandemic. Individuals in low-income families in foster care were impacted at a higher rate. Black women and mothers were impacted in a way that white men have not and will not experience. This is relevant to foster youth as well. The impact of COVID as a queer youth in foster care is a different experience. And I would love to quickly pause right there and just see if there were any questions before I dive into the research specific to queer foster youth. Okay, I threw a lot at you and maybe not in the clearest form, so I just want to make sure. Okay, great. Thank you everyone for listening. Okay, so the best way to talk often about this type of research is to look at a real life scenario. From what I found, there's only one city that has research done on the experiences and disproportionality and disparities of queer foster youth, and that's in Los Angeles. So it's great that this research is done in such a huge city, but there are cities around the US. Boston, there was nothing on Boston. Another huge city, New York City, you'd think there would be some research done there. There isn't. So all across the country, these youth are neglected due to their identity. And that is just another way that they're neglected on a daily basis. Okay, so in Los Angeles, the Williams Institute in 2014 looked at the disproportionality and disparities of sexual and gender minority youth in foster care. 17% of foster youth ages 17 to 21 in LA had been kicked out due to their identity, kicked out of their home. This is a prime example of how intersectionality impacts queer foster youth. These foster youth were kicked out due to their identity. If they weren't in foster youth, they wouldn't be in this situation. If they weren't queer, they wouldn't have been kicked out. But because they were queer foster youth, they experienced neglect and otherness and othering. And that is what intersectionality aims to represent. Blame placed on youth in need of new homes due to their identity was another really important fact found. So kind of on the reverse end, youth who couldn't find a consistent placement, the blame was placed on them, not on the system neglecting them because of their identity. And a fact that I found really hard to swallow was that 56% of queer foster youth spent time on the streets because it felt safer than their foster placement. That means that it was safer in these youth's minds, these youth who have been forced to be adults from such a young age, to spend time homeless without consistent placement, without consistent housing, without someone doing something to provide for them from such a young age. They felt that it was better for them on the streets simply because they were queer. So that is over half in LA. So lastly, I want to touch on this final point here. Due to barriers, many LGBTQIA plus youth won't feel comfortable identifying themselves as queer. And it is no wonder why, because when we think of the safety, the lack of safety, the increase of risk and harm for these youth when they do explicitly and outwardly identify as queer, suddenly they're not welcome and that blame is placed on them. And because there's such a lack of research and information, lawmakers, policymakers, it skews their perception of the problem. And there's less urgency then placed on creating policy to protect these youth, to advocate for these youth. And there's little care and urgency for care placed on the needs of foster care youth, queer foster care youth. Yes, so that is Los Angeles. It's hard to hear a lot of this data because it is so scary. And I think the scarier thing about it is that this is one of a kind, and that this could be happening at higher rates and we wouldn't even necessarily know in other locations. Okay, so now we're going to throw in another intersection, which is Black LGBTQIA plus foster youth. Just as queer foster youth and non-white foster youth experience the world in a way that is different from each other, Black queer foster youth also experience the world in a way that is much more neglectful than, non-Black LGBTQIA plus foster youth. So in this article, No Home and No Acceptance, exploring the intersectionality of sexual gender identities and race in the foster care system, the author in 2020 quotes, "Although the primary function of the foster care system is to ensure the immediate safety and well-being of youth, how they are cared for, and how the resources at their disposal greatly impact their future." Ultimately, the author finds that this is, not in actuality the case, that the system does not protect and ensure the immediate safety of our youth, and that is heightened when our youth are Black, are non-white, are identifying as queer. So while we may place trust in advocates in DCF, or maybe we don't, the fact is there is still neglect, and the identities that of our youth are not necessarily protected and are not necessarily advocated for. 1 in 3 children in the United States will have some interaction with the foster care system, which by the time they reach adulthood, which is a crazy huge number. But for Black children, it's 1 in 2, which just shows that there is a huge, huge difference between being white, being non-Black, and then being Black in America, and how that negatively affects you when you're looking at consistency in home life and in home care. Yeah, so the outcomes, the possibility of rejection, the neglect from the system, all in this article is outlined to be negatively and disproportionately ascribed to Black youth. So Black youth are going to face more neglect, are going to suffer from higher mental health consequences, higher rates of mental health insecurity. They're going to have harder times finding jobs, finding resources, finding support. All of these experiences are going to compound as triggers and stressors. The biases and stigma that Black queer foster youth face only amount on each other. I can tell you in the queer community, there is a lot of segregation based on race, and that is only going to be heightened when you place these youth in foster care, and there's a lack of education, a lack of ability for individuals to understand what expression is and what identity means for everyone. And there's a lack of resources. It's extremely difficult for Black individuals to find counseling and therapy because there are so few resources for Black individuals to become counselors and therapists. And therefore, there's so little ability for individuals to find counseling and care that, with someone that can understand their life experiences. This is very similar for queer individuals as well. And then in the foster care system, it's very hard to find individuals adequate therapy and counseling just for any foster youth as is. And then when we amount that with the lack of resources and lack of support for queer and or non-white youth, it only builds and builds on top of each other. So I'll just read off the quotes on the side. There isn't a whole lot to say beyond them. Black youth have an 83% heightened risk of homelessness, and LGBTQ youth have a 120% heightened risk. So you can only understand that when you combine those two identifying factors, when someone is experiencing life as a Black queer youth, that risk is only going to go up significantly. 1 in 4 LGBTQ young adults of color reported homelessness in the previous 12 months. So this was about 10 years ago. And in 2007, or not 10 years ago, sorry, only a few years ago. In 2007, New York City, 68% of LGBTQ homeless youth identified as people of color, 44% were Black, and 26% were Hispanic. So there's a huge problem of Black LGBTQIA plus youth being neglected in our system. And if we're not understanding the impact on those youth specific to their identities, then we're neglecting a huge portion of our youth, because we can't treat every youth the same when they experience society completely differently. Policies, the way that we solve a lot of issues, which is amazing. Removal of required adoption, foster care analysis and reporting system, which was the federally required semi-annual report on all children in foster care. So during the Trump admin years, this report was removed. It no longer exists, which was a huge loss for understanding on a federal level what is happening and what is going on with our children in foster care. But what we did find in past years is that there is no overrepresentation of queer youth and queer youth of color, and then therefore there's a lack of information. The first law to include LGBTQIA plus language regarding foster care was happened within the past 10 years, and in many states, conversion therapy and failure to abide by laws is very common, which only negatively impacts our foster youth more, who experience a lack of education and a lack of confirmation in their identity. Okay. Does anyone have anything they want to? I said I was doing questions at the end, but now I'm at some talking, and like people might have questions sooner.
Lily, hi, this is Rebecca. I do have a question. So am I correct in understanding that the data that was available with all your research was 9 years old with the LA data and 16 years old with what came out of New York City?
Sorry, no. So the research on Black queer youth was from 2020.
Oh, okay, I missed that. Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. I was beginning to think we're going to be in a whole generation beyond the data in terms of understanding. So that's good. Thank you.
And that's an interesting point too, because on the one hand, it's great that the data is recent, but it's also frustrating because there's so little data in the first place. So yeah, it's double-edged sword. So we'll move on a little bit.
I'm sorry, one more question.
Yeah.
Do you know what the rationale supposedly was in terms of during the last administration eliminating that collection of data?
I don't know the rationale.
I didn't know if that, okay, thanks.
I'm sorry.
No, well, I think you can all guess, but okay, thanks.
So we're gonna reflect a little bit. So I started off kind of talking about the bigger terms and the bigger concepts, and then I talked a lot about data and specifics. And now we'll kind of revert back to everything we talked about with our new terms. The unfortunate truth and this is from a research study, kind of similar to the research I compiled, is that circumstances typically don't improve, and this can look a lot of different ways. It can look on the short term that youth in foster care who are experiencing neglect due to their queer identity may not improve in the next 2 years, and that the care that they're in is going to be neglectful until they age out of the system. This can also look long term, that the negative effect on one's mental health is not going to improve over 20 years. In a way that is truly beneficial for one's mental health and long-term overall health and quality of life, because of how intense the neglect is when they are in out-of-home care experiencing this type of trauma. The level of rejection that foster youth face is already really, really intense, and the level of trauma that they experience, that is only heightened when the rejection is also separately and also combined based in their identity. So individuals, once again, intersectionality, individuals are going to face rejection because they're in foster care, because they feel neglect, because they feel that no family wants them, or no family wants them, or they can't find a place to stay. Individuals are also going to face rejection and neglect because they're queer and people have hate and homophobia directed towards them. Those are going to be combined into a separate level of rejection and neglect that individuals who are not queer are not going to experience, and individuals who grew up in a loving family are not going to experience. We also live in a society that is very gender binary. What that means is everything is very male or female oriented. We have male or female bathrooms. We have a boys and a girls section in stores. So we have blue and pink toys for boys and girls. So individuals who are genderqueer, non-binary, maybe who are queer but don't ascribe to, masculinity as a boy or femininity as a girl, are going to face that level of rejection and neglect in society, as well as sexism, in terms of living in a society where girls are expected to be subordinate and marry a man. And what if a foster youth is lesbian and wants to, flaunt that they're attracted to other women? That is going to have a negative impact on them from a homophobic lens and also from a sexist lens. They're not being feminine enough. They're not, doing what they're supposed to do as a woman. I can go on and on. These youth are also just generally faced with cultural incompetency. At the end of the day, the lack of information only proves that there is a lot of incompetency within society. So as advocates, it's really important to understand that, these youth every day are going to be faced with incompetency, whether it's because they're queer, whether it's because they're in foster care, whether it's because they're queer foster youth. The individuals they're interacting with are going to ridicule them, look at them with, a different lens than maybe other youth. And it's all because of a lack of information, acceptance, and knowledge. It's the duty of the child welfare system to protect children from harm and to act in their best interests, yet around 17,000 children aren't out of home care in any given month. And some more numbers. 7.5 million children are referred to Child Protective Services. 38% will receive an alternative response, and 9% will be referred to out-of-home care and foster care. So this system is huge. It's huge, and so many kids are impacted by it. And just because of that, the ratio of these youth that are queer is large, and yet there's so little acceptance and resources for them to accept them and make them feel more seen, more heard. Foster youth are at a greater risk of suicide, homelessness, mental illness, substance use disorder, sexual assault, discrimination, as well as there are reports showing that they have lower educational attainment, greater financial insecurity into adulthood. And at the end of the day, you could likely replace this quote, the aspect that says foster youth, you could likely replace it with queer youth, non-white youth, as well as, putting those identities together and understanding how, and then you would see, queer foster youth are at a greater risk of suicide because queer youth are at a greater risk of suicide, and so are foster youth. That is that quote there. So in 2020, there was a statement released, apologies, by advocates in response to the Trump administration getting rid of the semi-annual report, understanding the impacts on LGBTQ youth in foster care and youth in foster care in general. The policy mandated that group home administrators, public child welfare professionals, and foster parents complete training on topics related to sexual orientation, gender identity, and the rights of LGBTQ youth. So as these advocates noticed that, this was all going to disappear, they released a statement which unfortunately did not garner a lot of attention and also did not make a huge difference on, the state's interest in, making changes at the state level. But it is good to know that there are groups out there, CASA being one of them, that caters to the needs of foster youth and therefore will take interest in the needs of queer foster youth. So resources, Worcester, Mass, and CASA. So data from 2022, CASA served nearly 400 children in need of care. This most definitely included queer foster youth. That's really important to think that, it's important to understand how meaningful this work is. You're giving these youth the ability to feel comfortable with an individual. So it's therefore our job to, cater to the needs of these youth and make sure that their needs as queer youth and as queer foster youth are met. In Worcester, nearly 2,000 children live in foster care due to abuse, neglect, or other mistreatment. A lot of this mistreatment is likely because of their queer identity. Nearly 800 children are placed into the Worcester juvenile court system each year for support. So it's awesome that CASA has a hand at around 50% of those youth. And in Massachusetts, nearly 8,700 children are removed from their homes because of abuse or neglect in Massachusetts. And we can tie that right into one of the first facts of the night, which was that so many children leave their homes or are kicked out of their homes, whether it be on purpose or an accident. They leave because of their identity. So I compiled some resources for advocates. These are the first one is for LGBTQ individuals and families. So if you do, advocate for youth who is identifying as queer or still trying to figure out, their identity, or their families looking for research to better support their youth, that's like a great link with a lot of resources on there. There's one for resources for foster parents regarding LGBTQ youth, foster families, how to support youth in foster care. There's a National Foster Care Parents Committee on LGBTQ youth, families and youth link, and the Human Rights Campaign is a really big organization that works to advocate for queer individuals, and there is a section on foster care, which is amazing. But mind you, all this research, all of these articles, they are new and recent and saying a lot of the same things that I'm bringing to light today. And what we need is for, the research to hit deeper, to hit actual cities, actual areas, counties, districts, whatever it may be, so that those districts, counties legally can make a difference in these children's lives through policy and through law. Okay. How can a CASA advocate help? We do the hands-on work. We're going to see these individuals, see these children. Support is huge. And this is a very vague term, but at the end of the day, what we need to do is be there to support and say, yes, you're valid and you are good and great and amazing and strong, with any changes, questions, confusions, decisions that may occur. Listening, once again, seems pretty obvious, but at the end of the day, if you aren't listening, your children will be able to tell. They'll know that you aren't really listening to what they have to say. Active listening is always a skill to practice. And when they're disclosing important information, important experiences, like how they interact as a queer youth in the foster care system, that's an important time to listen. Empathizing, understand how boundaries and discrimination impact the youth you're working with. Being able to try and put as many feet in their shoes as you possibly can, and understanding the pain and the neglect they may be experiencing. Advocate. We're advocates, that's what we do. So listening and considering what your child needs for support and making sure that's heard, because it's not always easy for them to say it for themselves. And it's important to take the knowledge from all this research And your child may not understand what they're experiencing. They might tell you something and say, oh, this happened to me at school, but they aren't going to say, oh, I'm one of the 3 children who experience X, Y, and Z. That's for you to know and for you to decide and for you to go and say, as an advocate, okay, I can bring this to someone and say, this is what my youth is experiencing. They don't know it, but I do. And providing the resources, it doesn't have to be from this presentation. I found 5 or 6 links that can be, potentially helpful. But providing resources doesn't necessarily need to be a link to a website. It can be a book about a queer girl who struggles to find her identity. It can be about finding a good movie. It can be about getting her adequate therapy with a queer therapist who, can resonate with this child's life experiences. So that is, as advocates, what we can do to help. And now I want to say thank you, because as Jordan knows, I was very nervous, but this research is there's more of it than I was expecting, but not enough of it at all by any means. So putting this all together was definitely, painful and heartbreaking. And I hope that you all will now go on and find information of your own. But I really do enjoy this work and I'm going to continue looking into it. So if you have questions, I'd love to, receive an email from many of you. And if you have any questions, now is definitely a good time to ask. And if you don't have any, hopefully that means I did my job right.
This was fantastic, and it certainly was informative and increases my interest in getting more information to better understand it, so that I can be a better advocate for kids in this situation. It's I wonder how much DCF gets trained in it, and how much the foster parents really receive, because that's who's with them mostly, the foster families. So anything that we as CASA can do in influencing DCF to really put it at top of mind, I think would be good. You're only 21, wow. You did a great job.
Thank you.
I agree with that, Lily. This was a great presentation. It's really helpful, I think, to think of the magnitude of the issues. Even though we're only working with kind of one family at a time or one group of kids at a time, it just makes us a little more aware of paying attention to that issue, even if the kids are really young.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Fran, I think you asked another question in the chat as well. It says, what happens to the 2,000 Worcester County kids in foster care who don't get into the court system? Only 800 do.
If I read the stats right, that was that there's a lot more kids in foster care that don't go near the court system and obviously don't get a CASA, because that's the only way you get a court system. But what happens? Is it like short term, or how come there's that number discrepancy?
So I'm almost wondering if that was more broad than just Worcester County. Whenever cases come through the court in Worcester County, the judges do get to decide if we're appointed to the cases or not. But I am under the impression, Carlene, Chrissy, anyone on this call that knows more than I do, I am under the impression that when a kid is in the state's custody, a court case does follow it. So it's usually not a temporary kind of thing just held through the department, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the number I believe was meant for Worcester County, so my apologies.
Okay, so just so I understand it, if a child gets into foster care, they do within a fairly short period of time get before the court, and then at that point they may or may not get a CASA assigned.
Yes. So the judges, they either decide to, the judges or attorneys, they can motion for us to be on. They decide either at that 72-hour hearing initially off the bat that we would be useful on a case, or if there's some sort of issue, some sort of disagreement as the case goes on, and we were not appointed at the beginning of it, they can always assign us at any time to be another set of eyes on the case.
Thank you, Jordan. That's very helpful.
Absolutely.
Every child that is in the foster care system at one point, whether it's the 72-hour hearing or another hearing, I can't remember the name of it, but it's called like the child ID, where the judge does get eyes on the child in the case. Like Jordan said, it doesn't necessarily get assigned to CASA, but a child is always identified in person by the judge if it's in the hearing process.
Any other questions or comments for Lily? No?
I have one, if none of the advocates have one. So if you were thinking, Lily, you're going on your first visit with a child you've never met before as an advocate, how do you, without saying like, I've done research into LGBTQIA plus children in the foster care system, how do you say that without actually blurting it out? What are like some subtle ways our advocates can show that they took this, they have a little bit more knowledge? You know what I mean?
It depends who you're talking to, I'd say. So, if your child is 12, they probably don't even really understand it a lot themselves. So it's not really even something that an advocate would need to address until it comes up. With the adults, in general, I'd usually just wait until it's brought to your attention. You don't really need to address it until it's not your job to put the words in their mouths or put the idea in their mouths. But if their foster mom is saying, I've heard my foster youth say X, Y, and Z, which makes me think this, or their guidance counselor told me this, then it's definitely appropriate to say, like, I understand that these are a lot of the boundaries that may occur if that is the case, if your child is, identifying as queer or experimenting with their sexuality or potentially considering to use they them pronouns. It's then your job to say, well, this is a background that I have, and I'm comfortable discussing further with you on what this might mean, how you can better support them, and what resources may be available to you.
Lily, my impression is because this is so much more out in the open now, that say the 9, 10, 11-year-olds are much more likely to be questioning than they ever were when I was growing up. What does this mean? What does it mean about me? Not necessarily that they're making a decision in one direction or another, but the questioning seems like it's really big in that age group.
Yeah, I think it's definitely more comfortable. I think it's important to know that it's always been around. It's just individuals are more comfortable doing so out in the open or seeking assistance or seeking resources. So, but also I completely hear what you're saying and agree that 9, 10, 11-year-olds in 20 years ago may not have heard the term gay in a positive way. They may not hear it until they're 15 or know what the actual definition is because no one's talking about it. But now they are. So, but it's also still, good to remember if you go somewhere else that isn't Worcester, Boston, or New England, there may not be the same environment, which is another reason why the research is so important. But yeah, it's definitely something to keep in mind. It doesn't matter what age the child you're advocating for is, they very well could have this conversation with you, have a conversation with you where this research is important to internalize.
Tim, I see that you unmuted yourself. Did you have a comment or a question?
Did you ask me, Jordan?
Yes.
I didn't. I unmuted myself because I wanted to thank Lily. I thought this was really great. But I do have a little bit of experience in working with some youth on this front. And I do think it can be helpful, within the age ranges that we've been talking about, at some point, not necessarily early on in a visit, but to figure out some way to express that you have an openness and to accepting people with LGBTQ identities. I think for many youth, I'm speculating here, but particularly in foster care, they may feel like they don't have an adult who would respect them if they shared their identity. So I don't exactly have any great tips on how to convey that. I think it would generally depend on the relationship and how you communicate. But if you can express an openness to that, either by talking about some other experience that you've had or someone else that you know or yourself, whatever the situation may be, I think that could really be relieving for a youth who might not even share anything with you immediately, but it might even just letting them know whether they have an LGBTQ identity or not, letting them know that you have an openness might help.
Can
Yeah,
I add one note to the end of that? Sorry,
Yes.
Lily, I don't want to cut you off. I will say right away, Lily, when you introduced yourself, you said your name and then your pronouns. And I will tell you, anyone that introduces themselves using their pronouns right off the bat, I assume has some sort of knowledge in or lived experience, has had conversations about the community and the marginalization that the community faces, etc. So I think that's kind of bouncing off you, Tim. That's one way. It's pretty simple, right? And it's casual. I'm Carlene. I use she, her pronouns. I'm really excited to get to know you over the next couple months of your case. Some kids that know, it'll like put a little check mark in their brain.
definitely. Yeah, I think the big thing is just not to assume anything ever. Depending on your relationship with every kid separately, there may be a time when you can say maybe they'll bring something up in school and where someone presented on sexual health and they talked about gay sex, and you just show that you're not adverse to that and you're not opposed to the conversation. But generally, as long as you're showing aspects of comfortability and acceptance in other realms, eventually that child will, if they feel confident or comfortable in some level of their sexual or gender expression, that is a part of their identity. So if you're showing acceptance in other aspects of their identity, that's going to translate to acceptance to sexual and gender identity as well.
Any other questions or comments?
Great job, Lily.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Chrissy.
I'm so
Great
proud.
job.
She's my advocate. I'm so proud of her.
She
Yes,
is.
thank you very much, Lily.
Yes, thank you so much, Lily. We really appreciate all of your knowledge and just continuing this conversation. It's so important within our organization. Everyone on this call, I am going to have access to Lily's PowerPoint. She has a ton of resources on there for advocates, so I will make sure that every single one of us has access to that PowerPoint so that we can keep those resources handy. And as always, if anyone needs anything, let me know. Any questions about this, I can start an email thread with Lily to keep the conversation going. Thank you guys. Have a great rest of your night.
Thank you.
Thank
Very
you.
much.
Great
everyone.
presentation. Thanks,
you.
Lily.
Thanks, Lily.
Bye.
Thank you.